Okay, good morning and good afternoon, everybody. Again, welcome to the Washington Policy Pulse. We are going to talk a little bit about random stuff that's happening here in Washington this week, just because we have a lot of stuff. Again, my name is Nathan Dean. I'm a senior policy analyst here in the Washington, D.C. Bureau. I promise we have more people that work here. I know every week I say that there's nobody. We do have more people. But we want to talk a little bit more about just some of the random stuff that's happening here in Washington this week. Also joining me today is Elliot Stein. He's going to be talking about one of the pieces that we put out last week about whether or not President Trump can fire Jerome Powell as chairman of the Fed. But before we get to Elliot, a couple of things just to keep in mind. First off, this is going to see a little bit more of the geopolitical aspect of this week. There are a couple of UN votes happening in New York. President Macron from France is here this week. Really not all that much important to those of us in the markets. I think it'll be interesting to see these UN votes and how they maybe differ between European allies and the United States on some of these resolutions. But again, I don't think there's really going to be all that much for us to talk about. Other things, just want to keep in mind, March 4th is the State of the Union. We're going to have our update or our preview on the State of the Union out next week, right before so. So if you want to talk about the State of the Union, I'll have that out for next week's Washington Policy Pulse. Also, that's the tariff deadline, so certainly look for these headlines and True Social posts over tariffs. And this is specifically the Canada and Mexico tariff. Remember back in the day, President Trump said a 30-day extension. That would be coming up next week. We've gotten a lot of questions from clients on how do we actually track tariffs and how do we think President Trump's going to move forward with it or not. What I've always told my clients, and I think I may have said this on the call, so if I'm duplicating it, I apologize. But what I tell my clients is that we have to look at see President Trump's statements and True Social posts to see if there are nuggets that countries can offer in these negotiations to give President Trump a win. When you talk about reciprocal tariffs, for example, if it is just a matter of case of you charge us X, therefore we are going to charge you X, well, then I think there's a really high likelihood these reciprocal tariffs are going to go through. But if President Trump were to say, like he did in the Canada-Mexico example, that he was focused on fentanyl and border security, then there are answers that can actually come back. So we'll see, but we haven't really seen much in the statement of negotiations or what President Trump wants for Canada and Mexico. I think that's going to heat up towards the end of this week, so don't be surprised if you do so. Lastly, one of the things that I want to mention before we get to Elliot is two things, actually. One is Thursday, we're going to have a nomination hearing for the Senate Banking Committee for the next director of the CFPB, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which is kind of ironic. We're going to really be interested to see in what happens in that hearing because over the weekend, Russ Vogt over at the OMB actually got rid of its lease with the CFPB, so the building probably won't even be the CFPB or they'll be able to house the CFPB going forward. So, still trying to figure out what the outcome of that is. And then the last thing is Bloomberg News was reporting, I think many of you probably saw over the weekend that Elon Musk and the Doge committee from OPM sent an email to all federal workers saying, respond back with your 3 to 5 bullet points. And then Elon Musk went onto Twitter saying failure to respond would be seen as an act of resignation. Bloomberg News is reporting that I'd say about 2/3 of the agencies that have gone public with their response are telling their folks not to respond until guidance is given today. So we'll see, but I think the fallout of this is going to play out over this week. So you're going to see a lot of news headlines on that. So I have a couple more things, but I wanted to turn it over to Elliot just to give us a little bit more color on President Trump and Jerome Powell, because there's a lot of people out there. And when Jerome Powell was asked this, can President Trump fire you? He just said no. But Elliot has an interesting take that I think you should hear.
Hey, thanks, Nathan, and hi, everybody. Yeah, I think I'm a little less optimistic than Jerome Powell is in his job security. So there's a bunch of cases I'm following, and these involve President Trump removing heads of agencies, and I think these will have implications for the Federal Reserve as well, and Trump's ability to fire Federal Reserve board members. So the cases involve a commissioner on the National Labor Relations Board, that's the NLRB. Trump removed one of those commissioners. He also removed what's called the head of the Office of Special Counsel, which oversees whistleblowers, not to be confused with another, not agency, but position of the same name, which, investigates investigated both President Trump and President Biden for potential wrongdoing. It's a different position. But what's notable about both those agencies, and there's another one too that he fired the head of, which is the Merit Systems Protection Board. These agencies all have what's called for-cause removal restrictions, which means that the president can't, the statute says the president cannot fire the head or any of the commissioners unless the president has cause, and cause is generally interpreted to mean some sort of malfeasance or neglect or inefficiency. But when President Trump removed these folks, he didn't cite any cause. And that's relevant for the Fed because the Federal Reserve Act has a similar for-cause removal restriction for the president, excuse me, to fire Federal Reserve Board members. Interestingly, the Federal Reserve Act does allow the president to demote the chair, or the vice chair of supervision. So in theory, based on the language of the statute, Trump could demote Jerome Powell from his Fed chairmanship, but he can't fire him completely from the board unless he has cause. That's what the statute says. A few years ago, the Supreme Court, in a case concerning the CFPB director, which is a single director agency, the CFPB said that a for-cause removal restriction is unconstitutional because it basically intrudes on the president's executive authority. And so that's why President Trump, when he came into office, was able to remove Rohit Chopra from the CFPB, and he could also remove the FHFA director because that's another single director agency. So there's really no question anymore about those agencies. But the question is, are for-cause removal restrictions constitutional or not for multi-member agencies like the SEC, the CFTC, the FTC, the FCC, the NLRB, and of course the Federal Reserve. Basically, the most important precedent that everyone still relies on to determine that question is a case from 1935 called Humphrey's Executor, which involved the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission. And back then, the Supreme Court said that for-cause removal restrictions are fine. They're constitutional for multi-member agencies, provided that they don't exercise substantial executive authority. And at the time, the FTC was a little different than it is now, and so the Supreme Court in 1935 concluded that it didn't exercise executive authority. It was more like a quasi-legislative or quasi-judicial body. So, it's basically an open question still, and we'll see in these cases that are pending with the NLRB and the Office of Special Counsel and the Merit Systems Protection Board exactly what the Supreme Court says is executive authority or not, and whether for-cause removal restrictions for multi-member agencies survives or not. I am not optimistic that, like I said earlier, that Jerome Powell will be able to survive on the argument that he has for-cause protection. And the reason I say that is because the Federal Reserve has authority to promulgate rules. It can make rules and regulations. It can prosecute enforcement actions, things like Wells Fargo's asset cap. And those are generally considered executive powers. Now, for sure, the Fed does a lot of other things, right? And in terms of monetary policy, that is probably not considered executive power. And interestingly, just last week when the president issued an executive order saying that all rules and regulations have to go through the White House, they sort of made that distinction between what the Federal Reserve Board does in terms of its regulatory powers and what it does in terms of its monetary power. But given that it does have these regulatory powers, I think the Supreme Court, if it came to this, and I think inevitably we'll see a case concerning the Fed, I think the Supreme Court would conclude that its regulatory powers, which include enforcement actions and rulemaking, are enough for the president to be able to fire Federal Reserve Board members at will. So I think that's where we're headed. I'm watching several cases right now. We'll see where they go, but stay tuned.
Great. Thank you, Elliot. And I should note that Elliot's coming down to DC on Wednesday, so without asking him if he actually had work to do, if anybody would like to get coffee with us on Wednesday, just feel free to reach out because I always joke we're Washingtonians. We love getting coffee, so you're always welcome if you're in DC. A couple other things to keep in mind. One is marijuana rescheduling. I put out a note last week on marijuana rescheduling. If you were on my call back in the tail end of 2024, I was fairly optimistic that marijuana rescheduling is going forward. President Trump talked a little bit about, a lot of his support for marijuana, or at least, if not support, his ability, or at least his desire to not get in the way of certain marijuana restrictions. But it didn't get a ton of press, but President Trump on Truth Social a couple weeks ago nominated Terrence Cole for Virginia to be the next DEA administrator. And when he was, part of the DEA, and if you remember in this rescheduling argument, this goes from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. One of the things that we've always talked about is we think DEA staff historically still has some issues with this. We've heard, rumors and grapevines and so forth like that DEA staffers are not on board with this move. And Terry Cole is certainly not a supporter of marijuana. He's made a lot of statements over the last few years just saying it's AKA just say no, very much against this idea of loosening up marijuana restrictions. So I'm actually going to change my view on this. I went from 70% down to 40%. This is a fairly large drop. It's one of the biggest drops I've ever done. So if you are mad at me, I will always buy you a Bloomberg coffee. They're free, but I will always buy you a Bloomberg coffee on this. But I wanted to give you the heads up because I generally don't make big swings and calls like that. But when you have the DEA administrator, this is going to take a lot of political capital from President Trump to overturn his wishes, and I'm not sure President Trump is wanting to use that political capital at this point. So I apologize for that, but wanted to let you know. Other things going on, budget reconciliation. So this is probably the biggest thing that's happening here in Washington this week is the House is coming together to vote on a budget reconciliation package. Now, this is not the final bill. This is the outline. This is essentially is to kickstart the process so that they can move forth and come up with the specifics of what reconciliation would look like. If you remember, the Senate has been planning a two reconciliation package. They passed their budget resolution last week, was much smaller, $317 billion, deals with border, defense, little bit of energy, but really no tax, nothing like that. And then on the House side, you have one big, beautiful bill. Now, the instructions that have been put out would do things like increase the deficit 3.3 trillion over 10 years. It would also cut or aim to cut 2 trillion in terms of mandatory spending, and most of that is going to come from Medicaid. And so this is where the challenge is, because the Republicans right now have 218 to 215, which means if all 215 folks show up, you need 217. The Republicans can only afford to lose one person at the moment. And so right now, Speaker Johnson thinks that the vote is going to take place tomorrow night. I'm not confident of that. I think it's going to be kick the can to either later this week, if they can even get there, because I was just doing some vote counting this morning, and I saw 6 Republicans on the House side that I think are either no's or strong no's based off the fact that either the Medicaid support or they come from a purple district or, a variety of different issues. So again, we're going to see, but if it passes, all it does is gives the outline so that the various committees can then go forth and then actually come up with the specifics of what you're going to cut. And not everything's going to be made into it. For example, they included the REINS Act. This is a bill that would require Congress to approve or disapprove every major regulation that goes forth, essentially slowing down the regulation process. I don't think that's going to fly through the Senate parliamentarian, but still we're at the point where this is all of just the best wishes and ideas and so forth. So they're trying to get that through. I don't think it's going to happen this week. I do think eventually they will be able to get something done, because I think Speaker Johnson's biggest point here is don't slow down the process. This is not the final bill. This is just the outline. Don't slow down the process. We'll then fight again to another day, but we'll see. So stay tuned on that. Last 2 things I want to mention. Just remember, March 14th, we have a government shutdown. I'm going to have an update on that later this week. All I will say, though, is that as we anticipated, the rhetoric on whether a shutdown is actually going to happen or not has started to increase. I heard a lot of chatter over the weekend from friends and other folks in the DC community concerned about this. So expect that rhetoric to continue through the end of this week and into next week, especially the questions of what can Elon Musk do during a government shutdown. That's certainly something that we're going to be looking to figure out. And then finally, a little bit more on the lighter side. If you're going to come down to DC for the cherry blossoms, the National Park Service is going to have their cherry blossom forecast on Thursday at 11 a.m. So it's always very important because if you're in DC, you know you don't want to drive around the cherry blossoms. If you're not in DC, obviously you want to come down when the cherry blossoms are in there. So I want to say thank you very much for attending. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out, and we will love to get you any answers or data you have or you need. And again, thank you very much for attending. Have a great week.